Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone today. I'm delighted to lead today's virtual program on Beyond Oppenheimer, Building a Safer Future from Our Nuclear Past with our illustrious speakers. Our conversation is taking place as Christopher Nolan's new film Oppenheimer is garnering considerable praise and is being used around the world as a vehicle to spark conversations about how to reduce the risk of nuclear weapons. The release of the film and this conversation could not be more timely. As we speak, our colleagues, some of whom are joining us for today's webinar, are in Vienna, meeting under UN auspices as part of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, better known as the NPT, the cornerstone of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. We welcome, support, and celebrate their efforts. Today, Ukraine and Russia are gearing up for what many expect to be one of the bloodiest periods in the Russian-led war in Ukraine. It is almost impossible to believe that in 2023, we are experiencing a hot war in Europe, led by a nuclear-armed country whose leadership has repeatedly threatened to use those weapons. Every major nuclear power is investing in their nuclear weapons in ways that suggest they are becoming more rather than less usable. The United States alone is on the cusp of spending $1.8 trillion over the next 30 years on refurbishing its nuclear arsenal. We are living the greatest fears of Oppenheimer and his colleagues. J. Robert Oppenheimer has a complicated legacy, one that the film does not shy away from. It raises many questions relevant to today's geopolitical moment. Unanswered questions such as can and will we invest the time, resources, and know-how into governing technologies of our own making so that we may benefit rather than harm the future of life on Earth? Can we and will we encourage scientists to remain active and engaged in political debates, not at the expense of, but alongside of other political practitioners? And will we protect them when required? Can nuclear weapons be effectively governed? And many, many more questions that I hope we get to today. Questions like these led Oppenheimer and others like Hans Bethe, Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and even Edward Teller to support the founding of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 1945. Oppenheimer serves as the first chair of the Bulletin's illustrious board of sponsors. Oppenheimer and others believe that scientists, political leaders, educators, community activists, and others had an urgent responsibility to imagine and then create a world in which nuclear weapons would never be used again. In fact, many of the arms control agreements that led to the successful reduction and control of nuclear weapons during the second half of the 20th century sprang from organizations like the Bulletin and other organizations created by Oppenheimer and his colleagues, meaning we meet today in this virtual Zoom room as direct inheritors of Oppenheimer's legacy. I think he and they would be pleased to see us, if not crushed by the current reality we are living in, a world in which the doomsday clock is set at 90 seconds to midnight. To help us think through what can be done and to contextualize the movie that is gripping audiences, I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists. You have their bios in the program announcement, but as a reminder, Setsuko Thurlow was a 13-year-old schoolgirl when the United States dropped an atomic bomb on her city, Hiroshima. Today, she is a leading figure in the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, better known as ICAN, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. She was instrumental in the creation of the landmark Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted in 2017 with the support of 122 nations. She is joining us from Japan. Robert Rosner is the William E. Rather Distinguished Service Professor in the Departments of Astronomy and Astrophysics and Physics in the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Dr. Rosner served as director of Argonne National Laboratory, where he had also served as chief scientist. He was a chair of the Bulletin Science and Security Board from 2013 to 2021 and is currently a member of our board of sponsors. He's joining us from Chicago. Juan Manuel Santos is a member of the Elders and former president of Colombia. As president, he led complex peace negotiations with the FARC, ending 50 years of intractable civil war. In recognition of these efforts, President Santos was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016. He is joining us from Bogota. So let's start with an opening question for each of our speakers, which is, each of you has a lifetime of experiences that bring you to this moment and make you really exactly the right people to be talking with us today. Setsuko, you are an advocate and a grassroots advocate at the highest levels. And we'd love to hear your views on your experience, but how you come to this today and your story and how that brings you here. Then President Santos, we're going to turn to you to talk about the role at the international level and how you connect with this movie. Bob Rosner, for you as a chief scientist, you are an inheritor of many of the things we see in this movie, and we'd like to hear from you. But first, Setsuko, so much is left out of the movie, namely your experience. So let me turn it over to you. Setsuko, I'm going to ask you to take yourself off mute, though.
As a 13-year-old grade 8 student in junior high school, growing up in the city of Hiroshima, which had the population of 360,000 people, 10th largest city of Japan at that time. Well, at that time, Japan was desperately fighting in the war, and they mobilized young people. And we hardly had the classroom instruction. And I was chosen to be one of the 30 girls to be used at the military headquarters. So I was helping as a decoding assistant. Can you imagine a 13-year-old child doing something serious as that? Anyway, I was in a wooden building 1 mile away from the hypocenter at the Army headquarters. And the moment I saw the bluish white flash, intense flash, I had the sensation of floating in the air. And when I regained my consciousness, I found myself crushed in the collapsed building, in the total darkness and silence. And I knew I was faced with death. I started hearing my classmates around me. God help me. Mother help me. Then all of a sudden, in the total darkness, somebody shook my back, my shoulder, and don't give up, keep pushing, keep kicking. You see the light, and grow toward it and get out of here as quickly as possible. I'm freeing you. And that's how I came out of that. And the world I saw was just so incredible. It was a bright summer morning, but by the time I came out, it was dark like twilight. And we were told to escape to the hillside by joining the procession of ghosts. I say ghosts because people just didn't look like human beings. They were so blackened, burned, swollen, and the hair was standing up. They were naked, collapsing as they moved. And nobody was walking, simply shuffling. And we joined that procession, escaped to the nearby hillside. At the foot of the hillside, there was a huge military training ground about the size of 2 football fields. And by the time we got there, by stepping over the dead bodies, the place was packed with the dead bodies and dying people. But it was an eerie feeling. Nobody was shouting, nobody was running. Nobody had that kind of physical, psychological strength left. Everybody was simply begging for water, groaning, mourning, water, water, please. But there was no way we could offer that, no cups and no containers to carry water. So 3 girls who were lightly injured went to the nearby stream, washed off our blood-filled clothes, bodies. And we tore off our blouses, soaked them in the cold water, and rushed back to the dying people, put the wet cloth over their mouths, and they desperately sucked in the moisture. That was a level of so-called rescue operation we could offer. I quickly looked around. There was not a single medical doctor and nurses. After all, about 90% of the healthcare professionals were killed themselves. Not where I was, not a single person. So thousands of people under the hot sun without medication, no care. They just sucked in the moisture we offered. And that's what we repeated all day. When the darkness fell, we sat on the hill, and all night we watched the entire city burn. That was my day. But the rest of my schoolmates went to the central part of the city together with the grade 7 and 8 students from all the high schools of the cities. They were engaged in a certain manual task to prepare for the anticipated air raid. And there were about 8,000 grade 7 and 8 students from all the high schools. And with the heat of 4,000 degrees Celsius, most of them just simply vaporized, carbonized, incinerated. My cousin was there, my sister-in-law was there as a teacher supervising the student. Hardly anybody escaped that. I can go on, but that was the story. Anybody who were on the streets, on their way to school or the work, was simply burned. And it was not just the heat, but the blast, but the unique characteristic of that was the radiation. And with the radiation, nobody could recognize the external symptoms. I was happy when my uncle and aunt survived. They looked all right, but a week later, they started developing purple spots all over their body. And within 2 weeks, both of them died. That is a story to 36,000 children and women and elderly living in that city. It was indiscriminate atrocity, because most of the able-bodied men were at the front line fighting. We had to make things going at home. And those are the people who were victimized in such a horrific way. And that continuing death of the victims who were suffering from the effect of radiation, it's still continuing today, almost 80 years later. Atomic bomb hospitals in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are packed, and they are dying with leukemia and all kinds of cancer. That's the story. And of course, we suffer from homelessness, hunger, and lack of medical care and all that. But after Japan's surrender, occupation forces came in, they started feeding us false information, misinformation, disinformation, lies. And they trivialized the effect of radiation, for example, or where anybody who had to die in Hiroshima are all dead. Well, one American general said that. No, that's not true. People are still dying today. And so we grew up with the false information, secrecy. And that's a story which is continuing today. Where I can go on, but that was my first day interval. Yeah.
Thank you. It's obviously a very powerful story. And I think for everybody, with the hundreds of people who are on, they're going to absorb that, especially because that is not the part of the story that we see in the film. So we're going to come back to you for more. President Santos, that's a very difficult conversation to follow. But I thought maybe the way we could segue to you is that you had spent your career a high point of your career was the ongoing negotiations with the FARC, but now you're with the elders working on a number of issues, including reducing the risk of nuclear weapons. For some, that might seem like a big jump. What brought you to this issue at this moment?
Well, thank you first for inviting me to this very interesting panel. I go back to 1970s when I started my professional life. At that time, I worked with the International Coffee Organization, which was a perfect example of cooperation. It was a UN institution, and consumers and producers were working together to help the coffee peasants. At the same time, back in the 70s, there were huge demonstrations against nuclear weapons. We go to the 90s. In the 90s, the world thought that disappearing nuclear weapons could be possible. But today, we are seeing the contrary. We are seeing the multilateral system under attack. And we are seeing how the nuclear threat is getting bigger and bigger. That's why the elders, we chose this issue back in 2019 as one of our priorities. We were seeing the US withdrawing from the range of arms control agreements. What followed was Putin's decision to suspend the New START, the threats with the Ukraine war to use the nuclear weapons. We saw his predecessor just a few days ago repeating that threat. So we are very concerned as elders, and I am very concerned. And I had a personal experience also, which enhanced this concern. Precisely the day that you, Dr. Bronson, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, I was present when you unveiled the doomsday clock. And you chose to put it 90 seconds, the closest to doomsday ever. That same day, we went to visit the Russian ambassador with the chair of the elders, Mary Robinson, and we went to speak to the Russian ambassador to see if there is a way to create channels of communication, some partial agreements between Russia and Ukraine. And at the same time, I asked him, is there any possibility of renewing the dialogue with the US on nuclear arms control? And his reaction was very vehement, extremely firm, saying, no way, we will not talk to the United States unless they understand that we have to change the world order. And at that moment, and remember that the Russian ambassador, was the one who negotiated the START agreement. So we were very surprised. Of course, the conversation did not continue, but I was extremely concerned because what we are seeing right now, China increasing their arsenal, saying that they would want to have the same number of nuclear weapons as the US by 2030. The sophistication of the launching pads, the technology used to make nuclear weapons more precise and more deadly, all that brought us, the elders, and brought me to be very concerned with this issue, which in many ways is linked to the other existential threats that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the elders are trying to contain, or at least to reduce.
Thank you. Bob, picking up on the same theme, you in many ways are an inheritor of many of the legacies of what this movie has talked about. You're at the University of Chicago, you directed Argonne, which over time moved to nuclear power rather than weapons. Tell us a little bit about your story of what brings you to this issue now and your view on where we stand on in this kind of historical moment with nuclear weapons.
I'm glad to describe how I got to this point. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. So my connection to what goes on in the nuclear weapons program in the United States has to do with the decision of the United States to basically act as if the Senate had ratified the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. As you know, we never did, but we signed it. And what that meant is that, I think my screen got changed a little bit. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So one of the consequences was that the United States was no longer going to take bombs to Nevada to blow them up underground. And my own sense was that it was an incredibly important step, because I think the idea that the nuclear states would return to testing weapons would be just a horrible, horrible thing to do. We want to get away from it. So it turns out that the U.S. weapons establishment was a bit concerned how were they going to deal with the safety issues related to these weapons in the absence of testing, because all systems, complicated systems, age, and so the worst thing you can imagine is these bombs age in a way that basically turns them into things whose performance is no longer predictable, including having accidents where a bomb falls and it explodes through an accident. Horrible things can happen. So the United States decided to start something called a science-based stockpile stewardship program. What does that mean? That means using computer codes to basically try to figure out whether these weapons are functioning correctly, coupled to an inspection program. So you basically open them up and see whether things have deteriorated or not. But they were not sure this idea would actually work. And so they started a program, a partnership with universities, something called the Academic Alliance Program, where they challenged scientists to consider how would you deal with a complicated system. We're not talking about weapons now. We're talking about something very complicated for which you like to be predictive about the system's performance without having sufficient data to fully constrain the calculations. And so I became part of that program. I started a program at the University of Chicago to do something for which perfectly fit this definition, namely to study stars that blow up, supernovae. They're basically nature's version of thermonuclear bombs. We don't really, we can't go out and blow up stars ourselves, thank goodness. But we'd like to understand why they blow up. And so one of the things I got involved with is developing computer codes that can actually study these objects and predict what happens when a star explodes. And as I got into this program, I began to appreciate how super important it is that we do not return to testing. And the way that one ensures that is to make sure that these codes develop properly, and that there are proxy experiments that you can do in the lab that make sure that these codes are in fact predictive. In fact, one such experiment was actually done December 5 of past year at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, which was this amazing success of a controlled, not a bomb, but controlled nuclear fusion event. And that event was predicted by computer codes, and in fact, it stands as a success, mark of success of this science-based stockpile stewardship program. I emphasize here that that event on December 5 was not an experiment to deal with nuclear energy. It was related to the weapons program. So that's how we got involved.
Thank you. Setsuko, let's come back to you now. You have had this kind of amazing lifelong effort to try to rid the world of nuclear weapons, make sure they're never used again. Maybe tell us a little bit about ICAN and what you've done with them, and also whether you're optimistic at this moment in time about whether we're moving in the right direction. And I asked that because I saw a wonderful film on you in your life and how optimistic you were about getting recognition of getting the ban treaty through and signed, and so tell us a little bit about ICAN, and then how are you feeling about this moment, which seems so dangerous?
Well, suffering for years after the aftermath of the bombing, we survivors came to realize we had a special responsibility of sharing our experiences with the world. We have to warn the world about the arrival of nuclear age. This should never, ever happen to anyone else on the planet. And that became our motto, our mission. That's why we have been speaking out around the world the past almost 80 years. Well, it has not been easy to tell our stories. But over the years, people came to hear us, listen to us, join our efforts. And there were enough people around the world who said, that's right, let's get rid of the nuclear weapon. That's the only way we can have the security, guarantee of security. As long as there exists a nuclear weapon, there is always a danger of accidents and intentional use and so on. So since there were enough people around the world, we were able to come together to bring to the United Nations and to get the United Nations to adopt the newest treaty to control the situation, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So I think that leadership came with a lot of younger generation, not just people like us being involved with this campaign, but a lot of people came to work with us, and they were at the front line of the campaign. But horrifyingly, nuclear weapon states are not recognizing this newest treaty. And we believe both NPT, NTP, and W should be working together closely in order to achieve the same goal. This is the survival of humanity, but it's not happening. This is why I'd like to tell the world at this point, our government leaders, especially of the nuclear weapon states, have to look at the reality more seriously and change their stance. We really have to look into more seriously about the issue of disarmament. Now, how do I feel at this point? I feel I am grateful that the more people coming to be informed about the reality and feel the responsibility to do something to stop this horror. At the same time, I am very concerned, worried that government leaders are not fulfilling their responsibilities. They are not following the legal responsibility of Article 6 of NPT, for example. They took the legal responsibility, but they haven't made any progress. And this has to change. The world needs to continue. The humanity must continue. And so I have mixed feeling, the hope for the younger generation to join together to ensure their future. At the same time, a serious concern about inaction, lack of action by the responsible leadership at the top. They must listen to the voice of people. We must live.
President Santos, let's pick up on that, because I think you can really speak to the power, the limitations of ordinary citizens coming together to try to make change. When and how does that work? When and how, when you were in your negotiations that seemed so impossible and it seemed intractable, you were able to move that through? I would imagine sometimes the kind of activism of a populace can be helpful, and sometimes you just need leaders to make decisions. Like, how you sat there, how can we understand that in a different context? But exactly what Setsuko is talking about this need, how influential can it be? How important is it? Can you shed some light on that for us?
Well, it's extremely important to make people aware. Many people, especially young people, are not aware of the risk and what an atomic war, a nuclear war, signifies with the consequences. So that's, I hope that this movie will make many people aware of the risk. And I agree with my colleague, a Nobel colleague, that the world leaders are not being responsible enough, or not fulfilling their duties in this respect. And how do leaders respond? How do they act with pressure from the bottom? That's why it's so important to go to the grassroots and to try to convince as many people as possible to mobilize and to put pressure on the leaders to take the correct decisions. And it's the same with the climate change. Many leaders simply don't want to take the decisions because it's politically costly or for whatever reason, and we need to put the pressure on. That's why the elders are committed to this work of trying to bring out the message and mobilize the people in the grassroots and also the leaders. And that's the only way that we can see a better future. The grandson of Oppenheimer, which has written marvelous articles about many of the existential threats. He puts, I remember one article when he says, we need to do away with our tribal mentality and tribal warfare. And if we don't cooperate, as Oppenheimer said many, many years ago when he was being attacked by what he did, he used one phrase that I repeat a lot. If we don't unite, we perish. And that is a message, a very strong message. I went and a month ago to the Security Council of the United Nations, invited by UAE, who is going to be the host of COP28. And I went to ask them to get much more involved with climate change, because the Security Council is not getting involved at all. And I was surprised, sadly surprised, that this proposal got a negative reaction from Russia, a negative reaction from China, and strangely enough, also from Brazil, who's now a member of the Security Council. And I said, climate change, if we don't unite, we will all perish. The same with nuclear threat. With the FARC, we made what many people thought was impossible possible, simply by persevering, by persistence, having a lot of patience and a lot of empathy, putting yourselves in the other people's shoes. And now that my colleague Nobel, there's a phrase that Mandela used, saying the most powerful weapon is sit down and talk. We need dialogue. And I want to end with something that I think is very interesting. The wife of Nelson Mandela, a wonderful woman who is, she is a co-founder of the Elders, and she is a co-vice chair with Ban Ki-moon of the Elders, wrote a few days ago a letter, and I want to quote something that she said that could help a lot. She said, ever since the first atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the nuclear threat has been viewed through the prism of superpower relations and security policy, a traditional male domain. Men still significantly outnumber women in nuclear diplomacy. This must change. I think she is right. And I think involving more women in the negotiations of these type of issues would help a lot. And that's why I think that the next Secretary General of the United Nations should be a woman.
Bob, you have long advocated for scientist to scientist communication and engagement. You've often, you've been part of them. You believe they're important and they're possible. Tell us about why you think that is so important and what the role of scientists are vis-a-vis their diplomatic counterparts.
Yeah, so that's, you asked a really interesting question, which interestingly enough, wasn't completely covered accurately in the movie. The movie gave the impression that Oppenheimer was in charge and that he basically made the decisions. But that's a real misrepresentation of what actually was going on. The Manhattan Project was actually not run by Oppenheimer. It was run by Lawrence at UC Berkeley, together with Arthur Compton at the University of Chicago. They were actually the folks running the Manhattan Project. And Oppenheimer was basically, in a sense, working for them at Los Alamos. And there was, in fact, a a group of 4 scientists that were basically had the role of advising what was called the interim committee, which advised the president, Roosevelt, and then Truman. And those 4 people were Oppenheimer, Lawrence, Compton, and Enrico Fermi in Chicago. The thing that scientists have to deal with is that we're enablers of technology. We make things possible. If you ask yourself, do scientists decide? Well, we may think we decide, but we actually don't decide. Decisions are typically taken by other folks. And if you ask, what decisive step can a scientist make to really make their voice heard? Unfortunately, the pressing answer is really just to step aside, not to participate. Just to give you 2 examples of this, and it's important to understand this, are Lisa Meitner and Albert Einstein. Lisa Meitner was the theorist who was the first with her nephew to figure out exactly how fission worked. In other words, the beginning of the story in 1938. And she was Jewish. She escaped the Nazis by going to Stockholm. And in Stockholm, she decided not to participate in any of the bomb projects. That was her decision. So she had done the fundamental theory work to figure out how things work, but then decided, no, I am not going to participate in having anything to do with developing a weapon. And that's a personal decision that scientists has to make. Albert Einstein is another interesting case. He was the person who officially penned the letter. It was actually written by 2 other folks, but his signature was on the letter to President Roosevelt that urged Roosevelt to start what became the Manhattan Project. The movie does a very nice job of intimating what Einstein did subsequently, which is to absolutely stay away from anything having to do with the weapons program. There's a scene in the movie where Oppenheimer approaches him and asks him this question about, is it possible that the bomb could ignite the atmosphere? And Einstein basically demurred. He said, go figure it out. He was not going to answer that question. And I think that was emblematic of his whole attitude, which is he was simply not going to participate in anything having to do with the bomb. So that's an interesting point that, in the heat of the moment, at the time that the Manhattan Project was launched, the great fear was the Germans were going to get there first and build a bomb. They certainly had the scientists to do that. That fear that the Germans would get there first was just so intense. It's difficult for us to comprehend how great that fear was. And that motivated the Manhattan Project. In retrospect, it turns out, first of all, the Germans didn't have any success. They didn't really have a bomb project. Number 2, the Germans surrendered before Trinity, the first test of a bomb, occurred. They surrendered. So then the obvious question was, given what motivated the Manhattan Project, why was it continued after the German surrender? And then, of course, it was used on Japan. The Japanese never had a nuclear weapons program. They didn't even think about that. It was simply not on the table. And there is lots of speculation about the reasons for that. The official reason was to save lives because of the possible invasion that would be necessary to have Japan surrender. I personally think there was another reason, which was important, which is basically to scare the heck out of the Russians, the Soviets. I think that was, I personally think that was the real reason. So if you ask yourself, did the scientists, once they they demonstrated that it works at Trinity. What could they have done afterwards? Well, I think as Rachel, because you're the inheritor of what happened. The scientists at Chicago were the ones that founded the Bulletin, and they wrote a a report to Truman saying, "Don't do it. Don't use this weapon. Certainly don't use it in warfare. If you have to blow it up as a demonstration somewhere where there aren't any people." And then they predicted two things that came to pass. First, they predicted the arms race once the secret leaked out of how to build these bombs. And they predicted the MAD doctrine. They said that the only way you're going to get an equilibrium in a world in which there are lots of nuclear powers is if any attacker is going to be confronted with the fact that they will be attacked in a devastating way. It's the idea of mutually assured destruction. It's a horrible, horrible way of thinking about the future. Horrible. And the scientists predicted it. They said, this is what, if you act this way, that's what will happen. Of course, it's doubtful that Truman ever saw the Frank letter. It's likely that Secretary of War Stimson simply, didn't show it to him. It's very likely. And here we are today, trying to figure out how to stop the madness.
So I'm mindful of time. We have a lot of people on the line. There's a question in here, how many people are on this line? We have on and off is somewhere around 400 people on the line. The questions have come in. There was a question about the Frank report. So you answered one of the questions, Bob. Thank you. I'm trying to summarize the questions that I see here. My apologies to the audience. We usually do take questions, but this conversation has been so rich. I want to give time to our speakers, but I want to try to summarize the question that won't be surprising to those of you on the panel, which is, what can we do now? What can we do now? And what are the costs of not doing more? So I'd like each of you to take a swipe at that, and we'll see where we are when we go through those. And obviously the bulletin has some thoughts on that as well, but maybe we'll go in reverse order at the moment of what can we do now, and we'll go Bob, President Santos, and Setsuko. We'll let you finish with that question, this round of questioning. So Bob, what can we do now, or what are you doing now, if that's too hard of a question?
My answer is, I joined the Bulletin Science and Security Board because I think that's the way to do. We basically have to make plain to folks that we live in a time of incredible danger, that nuclear weapons are there. There are people who are serious about using them. There are people who today are even willing to threaten using them. And the only way to deal with that is to make it very publicly clear what the consequences are if we go back to using nuclear weapons. They are horrible. And oh, by the way, the weapons we're talking about are not the atomic bombs of World War II. We're talking about thermonuclear weapons. And it's very clear that thermonuclear weapons are an entirely different story. They are weapons designed to kill lots of people. So that's where we are. So I am hugely in favor of organizations like the Bulletin, like the Elders, like ICAN, to make it very clear what the consequences are if we don't figure out how to stop this madness.
President Santos, the Elders have some terrific papers. Please share them with us on thoughts about what people can do.
The Elders have proposed what we call a minimization agenda, the 4 Ds. The first D is doctrine, which means that all nuclear states should make clear the no first use declaration, or at the minimum, declare that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is for deterrence. The second D, we called it de-alerting, which means as many warheads as possible, if not all, should be taken off high alert status. The third D, which we call deployment, means that the numbers of actively deployed warheads should be significantly reduced, which is common sense. And the 4D, we have called it decreased numbers. The numbers of warheads in existence should be dramatically reduced to the lowest possible number, with the US and Russia reducing to no more than 500 warheads. This is part of the program that the elders have launched, and that's what we're working for. And of course, the consequences, well, Professor Rosner has said it quite clearly. He's a scientist, he knows much better than anybody. It will be a catastrophe. And I think one of the, what is missing in the film of Oppenheimer is precisely that, the message of what would happen if there's nuclear war. And another thing that is missing that it would be very powerful, because I used it in the negotiations here in Colombia with the FARC, is to visualize, to put the victims in the front, to make them much more activist in favor of peace, or in this case, of abolishing nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Setsuko, you've been, your organization and ICAN and others are looking for ways for people to be engaged. Please share with us your thoughts.
I have seen with my own eyes my dear city just disappear in one moment. And as my colleague has explained, that destruction, indiscriminate mass atrocity to non-combatant innocent civilians, killing hundreds of thousands innocent people. That was caused by one bomb considered to be primitive nuclear weapon. So we just have to use imagination. What could happen to us, to our lives, to our world, if current day bombs can be used? And we simply don't exist. That we should never allow. For that, we must inform ourselves well, better at least. And as a result, have the strong sense of responsibility for coexistence in this planet. And in order to do that, we must generate the pressure to the government. Government leaders have the major responsibility to call shots. They can't continue to use us as a tool for games. We refuse to be used. I can't think of the word, but the government should not keep playing the game with our lives. We have the right to live. That's it.
Well, I think those are strong and pretty clear concluding thoughts for other people who are on this call or come in or out. I think one of the key things that the founders at the Bulletin really focused on was everybody has something to offer to this fight. And whether you're a musician, an artist, an educator, a journalist, a political leader, whether you're a computer coder, a video designer, we've seen all people with all of those talents engaged in this, and it's going to require all of our talents to figure out how to keep this issue front and center. I think this movie does it in a way, and it's prompting these conversations, and it's reminding us of the horrors of this weapon. It's also left a lot of voices out. We didn't see the victims in Japan. We didn't see the victims in the United States, the downwinders, the uranium miners. We didn't see the victims in Kazakhstan and Algeria, the Marshall Islands, who experienced testing. There's a recent New York Times piece that talked about the fact that America nuked its own people through its testing. So a reminder that a lot of people continue to suffer the after effects of these weapons so many years later. And at this moment, our politics are leading us in a direction where these weapons are becoming seemingly more usable rather than less. So it's a really important time for us to think about new ways to engage our counterparts in our local communities. And I think, as President Santos was saying, it's going to require all of our voices. And I think what Setsuko has showed us is that one voice can make a huge difference, and many voices can make an even more powerful difference. So with that, I'm so sorry that we're out of time and we haven't gotten to all your questions, but it's been a true honor to be on a panel with 2 Nobel laureates and a leader of a US national lab. So I'm very humbled to be in your presence, and I'm very grateful that you all agreed to join us today. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned. Thank you.